Thanks a lot. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. So I want to first thank the organizer for organizing this wonderful gathering, and thanks Facebook for providing the venue and logistics support. I'm very excited to be here, and I would like to tell you a little bit about our work in developing machine reading for precision medicine. So precision medicine has become a little bit like a buzzword these days. And in the ideal world, what you want, obviously, is that every patient will be able to respond to the treatment they have prescribed to, which is represented by the blue person here under each drug, right? So unfortunately, in the real world, the blue person actually basically is completely overwhelmed by the red, which signify patients who don't respond to the treatment, right? So obviously, this is a well-known problem in medicine. The challenge used to be that we don't have sort of enough signal to distinguish who will be actually respond to the treatment and who don't, right? So if you think about cancer, for example, in the old days, we classify cancer by the originating organ, blood, lungs, and so forth. We put the biopsy under the microscope, take a look at the shape, the size, look at the CT scan, look at the pattern. So those are very, very coarse sort of information. And so the advent of big data promised to change this for the good, right? So for example, in the sequencing costs in the past 2 decades has been dropping from billions of dollars for a couple human genome to now under $1,000, and you can do it very quickly. And so in cancer, for example, from cancer biology, we know that the tumor is driven, pretty much governed by all the mutation. So by actually sequencing the tumor DNA, we effectively, literally staring at the source code for the cancer, and we can, in principle, distinguish a patient down to the individual level, right? So here is sort of like a poster trial example to show what the future might look like. I apologize a little bit for the image, but on the left, what you see is a late-stage melanoma patient who doesn't respond to the standard chemo, and normally he will not survive for very long. But if you apply, after applying this recently approved drug that specifically target a mutation in his tumor, right? You can see in the middle image that the tumor almost miraculously melted away in a few months with negligible side effect. So this is exactly sort of the dream scenario in precision medicine we want to get at. And of course, unfortunately, the cancer is very robust, so after a while, we figure out how to defeat the disease, defeat the drug, and then come back. So we still have sort of a lot of work to be done. And so as we mentioned earlier, the big data basically presents sort of an unprecedented opportunity where we can actually differentiate patients and figure out specific sort of personalized treatment that can be tailored to their individual condition. But big data also sort of present the sort of the classic information overload problem, right? So in a typical solid tumor, you often have hundreds of mutated genes, and only a few of them are actually driving the cancer, and you need to figure out those drivers. And overall, the human genome have 20,000 genes, which interact with each other in very elaborate way. There have been millions of variants that have been observed. We need to figure out what they do. And on the treatment side, there are already hundreds of cancer drugs that have been approved and thousands in the pipeline. So how do we sort of like interpret those big data and then leading to sort of like supporting decision making in the treatment side? That's sort of like the grand challenge now. And a lot of the sort of the knowledge that would be necessary to sort of interpret those big data, for example, what are those mutated genes originally functioning, what is the effect for mutation, and whether it confers sensitivity or resistance to a drug. And a lot of those knowledge are actually exploding, and they're scattered in a lot of text. So what we can potentially help out is to develop machine reading technology to unlock those knowledge from the text, which can be then used to sort of support the decision making in the treatment. And so to make the discussion concrete, so let's take a look at one key scenario called the molecular tumor board. So given the 500 mutation for a patient, here's how we are dealing with it today. Essentially, you gather a bunch of specialists huddling in a war room and trying to do sort of manual divide and conquer, right? Try to figure out how do we parse those information, and how do we actually, what would be the promising treatment options. the challenge for this is that it's not going to scale, right? So in the US alone, every year there are 1.7 million new cancer patients. And in the big cancer center already started sequencing almost everybody, but the tumor board can only review a tiny fraction of the patients. So in the ideal world, we want everybody to be able to get the best treatment decision-making as possible. But if you sort of do some back-of-envelope calculation, even if we have unlimited supply of oncologists, right, the sheer economy is not going to work. So what we actually really need is sort of developing technology to make those oncologists sort of become sort of super oncology. They can actually, diagnosis and devise treatment much, much faster. So one of the bottlenecks for those tumor board members is the knowledge involved. And so now Cancer Center basically try to deal with this problem by hiring MD PhDs to manually sort of look at papers and actually curating them into the knowledge base so that the tumor board member can actually have them at their fingertip. So again, the problem is that this manual curator, obviously, they're fighting against a huge fire hose of new papers, right? So every minute I'm talking here, there are 2 new papers pop up in the PubMed, and every day there are 4,000 new papers. One of the lead curator that we have been collaborating with told me that they probably curate about 4 papers a day, right? So that's very hard to catch up. So that motivates our first agenda, where we're trying to develop machine reading to try to help out this curator. So for example, given a piece of text, it might start talking about a patient cohort with certain genetic mutation. And then we went on to observe from the experimental data that they actually seem to be responding to a particular drug like Vemurafenib. And from this, you want to basically extract the knowledge that this particular genetic mutation confer a sensitivity to the drug Vemurafenib, right? So here we can potentially help those curators to curate much, much faster to be able to actually sort of leave no facts behind. And so that's sort of like kind of the more sort of mature area, which I will talk a bit more about. But this is only sort of really just the tip of the iceberg, right? So if you look at electronic medical record, there is also tons of text in there which contain valuable patient information. And so if you look at cancer again, so only 3% of the cancer patients, at least in the US, only 3% of them actually enroll in some clinical trial. So the knowledge you see in the paper ultimately come from some clinical trial, but actually the majority of the patient information are actually locked in the EMR system, and you are not actually seeing them. They unfortunately sort of become silos. So for example, in cancer, because of standard care often don't work, then oncologists actually often have to prescribe something that hasn't currently been through a clinical trial. And they observe the outcome and everything, and those are all in the EMR. And so if you can unlock those information and pull them together, that can generate new insight to help developing new drugs. And also, we can actually potentially apply this technology to help administrating the cancer trial itself, right? So in the clinicaltrial.gov, you can download all 200,000 clinical trial, and at any point of time, there are tens of thousands of active trials. So each trial is specifying what kind of patient they're looking for in the so-called eligibility criteria, and they are in very complex language. And so nowadays, the matching a patient with a trial is in a sort of depressingly manual process. It's kind of like by word of mouth, and it often from the patient point of view, it's a life and death question. From the pharma drug developer company point of view, a lot of the trial fail simply because they cannot recruit enough patients. So if we can develop machine reading technology to be able to understand the EMR, to be able to understand the trial eligibility criteria, then we can potentially increase the efficiency of this process dramatically. So hopefully I have sort of convinced you that, that there has been a lot of opportunity for NLP to help. Now, as you all are well aware of, one of the obviously challenge is that there is a lot of variation, right, as Luke alluded to earlier in the talk. So here, for example, is just a few examples to state the same thing about a tumor suppressor TP53 can inhibit the function of another very important gene, the apoptosis pathway. And if you look at a very small corpus, right, about what are the words that have been used to represent this kind of negative regulation event, there is actually a very long tail. And on the flip side of it, obviously, is that the same expression can also mean a very different thing. So there is actually a gene called PDF, and so you can imagine sort of a machine reader have to really sort of like have a hard time figuring out whether this refers to a gene or whether this is a text format and so forth. And Luke also mentioned earlier, like one of the big bottlenecks right now for the supervised learning paradigm is that we need a lot of label example. And so crowdsourcing has been a very powerful way to generate training example. It's kind of empowering the vision community with ImageNet, and Luke just give a beautiful talk on how do you do it in NLP. Now, for the more sort of specialized domain like biomedicine, one of the challenges, as Luke alluded to, is that often the Turkers don't necessarily understand the domain knowledge. And it's harder for the crowdsourcing to work. So we have been, for the time being, we have been basically pursuing sort of a complementary approach where we are trying to kind of bootstrap from a lot of the structural resource and trying to essentially hallucinate training data from those prior knowledge to compensate for the lack of direct label examples. So we have been doing a bunch of work initially focusing on fundamental biology, like how genes regulate each other, and more recently on the tumor board scenario, a little bit on the open science, etc. So let me sort of give you sort of like some cartoonish idea how this might work, right? So when we go back to our friend PDF here, initially we have no idea whether the PDF referred to a gene or a text format, right? But what we can observe is that there are 4 PDF mentioned here, and they are sort of very close by. So from the sort of the co-reference, so this is kind of like probably a co-reference for among these 4 PDF. So by just applying this sort of linguistic insight, we still don't know whether PDF is a gene or not, but at least we tie all these 4 together. They are very likely to refer to the same entity, right? Another piece of knowledge that you can, linguistic knowledge you can incorporate is the apposition structure, right? So a good writer, before they use an acronym like PDF, they will first define it, spell out the full name. So in this case, it would be the peptide deformylase at the top. So by recognizing this linguistic pattern in the parentheses and so forth, now you can draw another conclusion that the peptide deformylase probably referred is also a co-referent of all these 4 PDF mentions, right? And then the first piece of knowledge you can incorporate is that there is a lot of this structure now ontology in the medicine domain. You basically have complete ontology for the entity you care about, right? So in particular, you have the gene ontology, human gene ontology, where it basically lists all the synonyms about the PDF gene in which the peptide deformylase is one of the name of it. And the difference between peptide deformylase and PDF is that it's a much less ambiguous mention, right? It's unlikely to refer to something else. So when you combine all these 3 pieces of general knowledge together, you can actually, all of a sudden, you can start to infer that PDF actually probably is a gene in this context, right? So another piece of very powerful paradigm of this kind of indirect supervision is that many of you are familiar or have done great work in is the distance supervision, right? Essentially is that we, so the slide is, so essentially it's like you basically start with a knowledge base and then you take a look at the sort of the, sorry, the slides seem to be working a little bit oddly, but essentially the general idea is that you take the knowledge, the fact that you know about, you go to the unlabeled text, and then you can potentially automatically annotate training examples. There are also, you can also ask experts who know about the domain and so forth to write some rule, which actually take much less effort than comparing to annotating thousands of examples, right? So you can probably spend a few minutes writing some rule, and that can actually helps a lot. So so obviously for each of this paradigm, there has been a lot of work, and one of the motivation is that can we develop a general framework to combine all of them? Because each of these stores have a corresponding sort of strength and weaknesses. Each of them are not perfect. There is a different level of uncertainty and so forth. So what we want is to create a sort of a principal probabilistic framework to combine all of them. And essentially, you can represent them by as weighted logical formulas. And in fact, this basically defines joint distribution as a graphical model. And the labeling decision, which we don't have, we can model them as latent variable here, right? And then you can encode the prior knowledge as factors that governing the distribution over those latent variables. And this defines a probabilistic distribution. And we can imagining doing this end-to-end, but the graphical model can easily blow up. So instead, what we are trying to do is that we're limiting the probabilistic logic just to the encoding the prior knowledge part, and then for handling the text patterns and so forth, we are combining it with deep learning. So I wouldn't go into too much detail, but there is actually, you can think of this basically, there is a principal way to optimize this model by actually maximizing the conditional likelihood of virtual evidence. And you can think about those virtual evidence essentially it's kind of like a Bayesian prior, except the Bayesian prior normally is placed on top of a hyperparameter, but here we are placing on actually the variable assignments, right? And then the learning can be actually nicely decoupled by variational EM into two steps, right? You can first do probabilistic inference to infer the marginals on those latent variables, and that you can then view them as sort of probabilistic labels, and then you can train whatever your favorite classifier and so forth. And we also did a little bit of work by trying to incorporate sort of some of the known linguistic structure by extending the LSTM from a linear chain to incorporate some of those structure. Again, trying to get some free lunch and trying to limiting and helping the sort of the hypothesis space. So one of the sort of the focus in relation extraction in the past often have been limited to sort of single sentences, and this makes a lot of sense in things like Newswire and so forth, right? In terms of celebrity facts and so forth. If you care about, for example, Tom Cruise's marriage, you can probably find thousands of statements that are in the same sentence. But in places like biomedicine, the challenge is that what's most valuable often are like the latest medical finding, which might only appear in a single paper, right? And if in this paper it appears in different sentences in far apart, then if you miss that, then there is nothing you can do. So we have been sort of like focusing on sort of like document level cross-sentence extraction. So some of the result, I wouldn't go into too much detail, but the high-level message is that by doing this cross-sentence extraction, we can extract a lot more facts. By doing machine reading, we can actually, based on this sort of indirect supervision, we can also derive a lot more facts, and adding the graph structure help, especially the linguistic analysis high quality. We can also combine all this different kind of paradigm to substantially increase the precision and the recall. So finally, I would sort of like quickly conclude sort of like what we are trying to do. Essentially, we are not aiming to develop machine reading to sort of automate the whole process. Instead, we are basically trying to focus on the high recall, reasonable precision sort of scenario where in the past, right now, you're having those curators reading a 10, 20 pages paper from scratch to try to pull out the facts. Instead, you basically providing machine reading can provide sort of like high enough quality of the candidate, and then they can quickly go over each of them and turn the curation process into a very fast validation process, right? So each instant, each candidate fact, they can quickly click yes and no, and then be done with the curation. So there is so we have been focusing a lot on the knowledge curation part from the literature, but there is a bunch of exciting direction on the EMR. So I will stop here in the interest of time. Thanks a lot. Bye. Sorry. So I would want to quickly just acknowledge my collaborators, obviously without whom I cannot do any of this work. Thanks.